In 1949, 14-year-old Elvis Presley was forbidden from going to Beale Street, but one night he snuck out anyway. What happened when a blues club doorman invited him inside would change music history forever. It was a humid Saturday night in July 1949, and Elvis Aaron Presley was supposed to be in bed. His mother Gladys had been very clear about the rules. Beale Street was off limits. It was dangerous. It was where grown men drank and gambled. It was where music played that wasn't for white boys from Tupelo. But 14-year-old Elvis couldn't stop thinking about the music. He'd heard it drifting through the Memphis streets since his family had moved there from Mississippi a few years earlier. The sound of blues guitars, the wail of harmonicas, the voices that seemed to carry every emotion human beings could feel: joy, pain, longing, hope, despair. Elvis had heard the Grand Ole Opry on the radio. He'd heard country music and gospel in church, but this was different. This music felt like it was alive, like it was breathing, like it had a heartbeat that matched his own. For months, Elvis had been sneaking out after his parents fell asleep. He'd walked the 1.5 miles from the Lauderdale Courts housing project to Beale Street, careful to avoid police officers and anyone who might recognize him. He never went inside the clubs. He knew he wasn't allowed. White teenagers didn't belong in black blues clubs in 1949 Memphis. That was the way things were. The rules were clear, even if they didn't make sense to Elvis. Instead, he'd stand outside, pressed against the brick walls of places like the Monarch Club, the Palace Theater, and Club Handy, listening to the music that poured through the walls and doorways. The musicians inside had no idea they had an audience of one white kid standing in the alley, memorizing every note, every rhythm, every inflection of every voice. This particular Saturday night in July, Elvis was outside the Monarch Club. He'd been there for nearly 2 hours, standing in the shadows, listening to a blues band that was making his heart race and his soul ache in ways he couldn't explain. He was so lost in the music that he didn't notice the large man who'd come out the back door to empty the trash. "Boy, how long you been standing out here?" Elvis jumped, startled. The man was massive, at least 6'4", broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that seemed to see right through Elvis's fear. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just listening. I'll go." The man studied Elvis for a long moment. "You've been out here before, haven't you? I've seen you. Different nights, always in the same spot, always listening." Elvis nodded, afraid to speak. The man smiled. "My name's Big Joe. I work the door here. And you know what I think?" Elvis shook his head. "I think music this good shouldn't be heard through a brick wall. Come on inside, boy. Music doesn't live outside. It lives inside, where you can feel it in your bones." Elvis hesitated. "Sir, I don't think I'm allowed." Big Joe laughed, a deep rumbling sound. "Son, you think I don't know you're not supposed to be here? You think I don't know what year this is, what city this is, what color your skin is, and what color mine is?" He put his large hand on Elvis's shoulder. "But here's what I also know. Music doesn't care about any of that. Music doesn't see color. It just sees souls. And I can tell by the way you've been standing out here night after night that you've got a soul that needs this music. Am I right?" Elvis felt tears forming in his eyes. "Yes, sir. I don't know why, but when I hear this music, it's like I can finally breathe." Big Joe nodded slowly. "Then you need to come inside. Just stay near the back, keep your head down, and listen. Really listen. You'll learn more in one night inside than you would in a year standing out here in the alley." Elvis followed Big Joe through the back door into the Monarch Club. The moment he stepped inside, Elvis felt like he'd entered another world. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of whiskey. The room was packed with people, black men and women dressed in their Saturday night best, laughing, talking, moving to the music. And the music. Oh, the music. On the small stage at the front of the club, 3 musicians were playing. A guitarist who made his instrument sound like it was crying and laughing at the same time. A harmonica player who could bend notes in ways that seemed impossible. And a singer whose voice carried the weight of every hard day and every small joy that life had to offer. Big Joe led Elvis to a small table in the very back corner, partially hidden by shadows. "You sit right here. You don't talk to nobody. You don't draw attention. You just listen and learn. Understand?" "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." Big Joe nodded and walked away, returning to his post at the door. Elvis sat in that dark corner for the next 3 hours, and his entire understanding of music was dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. He'd thought he knew music. He'd grown up singing in church, listening to gospel quartets and country singers. But this was different. This wasn't just music. This was emotion made audible. This was pain and joy and anger and hope all mixed together until you couldn't tell where one feeling ended and another began. The guitarist would play a phrase that sounded like someone crying. The harmonica player would answer with a sound like laughter. The singer would tell a story about a woman who left him, about a job he lost, about a dream he couldn't reach. And somehow it all became beautiful. Somehow it all became something you wanted to hear, even though it hurt. Elvis watched how the musicians communicated with each other without words, how they knew when to speed up and when to slow down, how they left space for each other to shine, how the music was a conversation between them, and everyone in the room was invited to listen. During a break between sets, the guitarist, a man named Rufus Thomas, noticed Elvis in the back corner. He walked over, carrying his guitar. "Big Joe says you're a music fan." Elvis nodded, too nervous to speak. Rufus smiled. "You play anything?" "A little guitar, sir. Not like you, though." "Can you sing?" "In church sometimes." Rufus handed Elvis his guitar. "Show me." Elvis's hands were shaking as he took the instrument. He'd never held a guitar this nice. He strummed a few chords, then began singing a song he knew from church. "How Great Thou Art." But something happened as Elvis sang. The church song started to take on some of the feel of the blues music he'd been listening to all night. He added a little growl to his voice in places. He bent some of the notes the way the harmonica player had been doing. He let his voice carry more emotion than he usually allowed himself in church. When he finished, the small group of musicians who'd gathered to listen were quiet for a moment. Then Rufus laughed, not mocking, but delighted. "Boy, you just mixed gospel and blues like they were always meant to go together. That's something." Another musician, an older man with gray in his beard, spoke up. "Son, where'd you learn to sing like that?" "I don't know, sir. I hear things and they come out different." The older man nodded. "That's a gift. Don't ever let anyone tell you that mixing different kinds of music is wrong. Music is music. It all comes from the same place, the human heart." Rufus sat down next to Elvis. "Let me teach you something. You know what the blues really is?" "No, sir." "The blues is what happens when you take all the hard things in life, poverty, loneliness, heartbreak, struggle, and instead of letting them destroy you, you turn them into something beautiful. You take your pain and you make it into art. That's the blues." He showed Elvis a simple blues progression on the guitar. "This right here, these 3 chords, they're the foundation of almost everything you're hearing tonight. But watch what happens when you play them differently." Rufus played the same progression, slow and mournful, then fast and joyful, then somewhere in between. Same chords, different feeling. The trick is making people feel what you feel. That's what separates someone who plays music from someone who is music. For the next hour, the musicians taught Elvis things they'd learned through years of playing in clubs and juke joints across the South. They showed him how to make his voice growl and soar, how to bend guitar strings to make them cry, how to find the pocket of a rhythm and live there. But more importantly, they taught him that music didn't belong to any one group of people, that the walls between gospel and blues and country and rhythm were artificial, that the best music happened when you stopped worrying about categories and just felt what you felt. "When you sing," the older musician told Elvis, "don't sing like a white boy or a black man. Don't sing country or blues or gospel. Sing like Elvis. Sing like yourself. Take everything you've heard, the church music, the radio, the blues, all of it, and let it come out the way it wants to come out. That's how you find your voice." As the night wore on and the club began to empty, Big Joe came back to check on Elvis. "Boy, you better get home before your mama realizes you're gone." Elvis stood up reluctantly. He didn't want to leave. He felt like he'd discovered something essential, something he'd been searching for without knowing what it was. "Thank you," Elvis said to Big Joe and the musicians. "Thank you for letting me in, for teaching me." Rufus put his hand on Elvis's shoulder. "You come back when you can, but be careful. The world ain't ready for a white boy singing black music. Not yet, but maybe someday." As Elvis walked back through the dark Memphis streets toward Lauderdale courts, his mind was racing. Everything he thought he knew about music had been turned upside down. The rules he'd been taught, that different kinds of music belonged to different kinds of people, that you couldn't mix gospel with blues, that there were proper ways to sing and improper ways. All of those rules suddenly seemed meaningless. Music wasn't about rules. It was about truth. It was about feeling. It was about taking everything that lived inside you and letting it out in a way that made other people feel it too. Elvis continued sneaking back to Beale Street throughout his teenage years. Not every night, but whenever he could manage it. Big Joe always let him in through the back door. The musicians always treated him with kindness and shared what they knew. During the day, Elvis went to white schools, attended white churches, listened to white radio stations. But at night, in the blues clubs of Beale Street, he learned the music that would eventually make him famous. Years later, after Elvis had become a star, reporters would ask him about his influences. They expected him to name country singers or gospel quartets, and he did name them. But he also talked about the blues musicians he'd learned from, the nightclubs of Beale Street, the men who'd taught him that music had no color. Many people didn't understand. Some accused him of stealing black music. Others accused him of corrupting white music. Elvis was caught in the middle, trying to explain something that seemed obvious to him but impossible for many people to accept, that music belonged to everyone, and the best music came from mixing everything you'd ever heard into something new. In 1956, when Elvis was at the peak of his early fame, he returned to Memphis for a concert. Before the show, he went back to Beale Street. The Monarch Club was still there, though it had changed owners. Big Joe was still working the door. When Big Joe saw Elvis, now famous, wearing expensive clothes, surrounded by handlers, he smiled that same smile from 7 years earlier. "Knew you'd be somebody," Big Joe said. "The ones who really hear the music, who really feel it, they always become somebody." Elvis hugged Big Joe, not caring what anyone thought. "You changed my life that night. You all did. You showed me that music doesn't have boundaries unless we build them." Big Joe laughed. "We didn't show you nothing you didn't already know. We just gave you permission to believe it." That night, before Elvis performed at the Ellis Auditorium, he gathered his band in the dressing room. He taught them a blues progression he'd learned from Rufus Thomas. He told them about the nights he'd spent in the Monarch Club, learning from musicians whose names would never be famous, but whose influence would shape the future of music. "Tonight, when we play, I want us to remember something," Elvis told his band. "We're not playing white music or black music. We're not playing country or blues or gospel or rock and roll. We're playing music, just music, the way it's supposed to be played, from the heart, without walls, without rules, except the ones the music itself makes." Big Joe passed away in 1962, never having seen how much impact that one decision to let a 14-year-old white boy into a black blues club would have on music history. But his friends on Beale Street never forgot. They told stories about the scrawny white kid who used to stand in the alley listening through brick walls, who learned to sing like he had no tomorrow. Rufus Thomas, who went on to have his own successful music career, always maintained that Elvis had a gift that went beyond his voice or his looks. He had the gift of listening, Rufus said in an interview years later. He could hear what was true in music, no matter who was playing it or what they looked like. That's rare. That's special. The Monarch Club is gone now, demolished decades ago. Beale Street has been renovated and turned into a tourist destination. But there's a plaque there that mentions the blues clubs that once lined the street, the musicians who played there, and their influence on the birth of rock and roll. Some music historians argue about how much Elvis really learned on Beale Street. Some say he appropriated black music. Others say he celebrated it and brought it to a wider audience. But the musicians who were there, who let a 14-year-old white boy sit in the back of their clubs and learn their art, they always told a simpler story. Elvis loved music, all music, and he had the courage to refuse to let the world's rules about what kind of music belonged to what kind of people define what he created. "We didn't give Elvis the blues," one aging musician said in a 1980s interview. "The blues was already in him. We just showed him it was okay to let it out." Today, music historians recognize those nights on Beale Street as essential to understanding how Elvis developed his unique style. The way he blended gospel intensity with blues feeling with country simplicity, that wasn't theft or appropriation. That was what happens when someone refuses to believe that music has to stay in separate boxes. The story of Elvis and Beale Street reminds us that the greatest art often comes from breaking rules that never should have existed, that the walls we build between cultures and communities and traditions are artificial, and music, real music, ignores those walls. 14-year-old Elvis Presley wasn't supposed to be in those clubs. The rules of 1949 Memphis said he didn't belong there. But Big Joe, Rufus Thomas, and the other musicians on Beale Street understood something that the wider world didn't. Talent and passion don't care about rules. Music doesn't care about boundaries. When they invited Elvis inside, when they taught him their art, when they gave him permission to mix all the music he loved into something new, they weren't just teaching one boy. They were planting seeds that would grow into a revolution. Rock and roll didn't come from one place or one person. It came from the collision and fusion of different musical traditions: blues, country, gospel, rhythm, and blues, all mixing together when the people who loved those traditions stopped caring about the rules and started caring only about the truth. And it started in part because a doorman named Big Joe looked at a scrawny white teenager standing in an alley and said, "Come on inside, boy." Music doesn't live outside. It lives inside, where you can feel it in your bones. That night changed music history. Not because Elvis stole anything, but because generous musicians shared what they knew with someone who was desperate to learn. That's what great teachers do. They recognize hunger when they see it. They recognize genuine love of the art, and they teach, regardless of who the student is or what rules they're breaking by teaching them. Big Joe and the Beale Street Blues musicians gave Elvis a gift that night: permission to be himself, to mix everything he loved into something new, to believe that music belonged to everyone who truly felt it. And Elvis spent the rest of his life trying to honor that gift by refusing to let anyone put his music, or anyone else's, into a box it didn't want to be in. If this story of breaking boundaries and following passion moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs permission to create without limits. Have you ever broken rules to pursue something you loved? Let us know in the comments. And hit that notification bell for more true stories about artists who refuse to stay inside the lines.